weather report for Calgary. And then 2 years ago, 2016, they had the Fort McMurray fire. Incredible fire. I mean, it wasn't caused by climate change, but it certainly maybe triggered it. It had a factor. I mean, when you consider the fact in the 75 years of weather records, they ended up with the driest and the warmest fall, winter, spring. That was just a spark away from happening. And then it wasn't lightning, it was either a cigarette butt or a backfire of an all-terrain vehicle that caused that fire. And 88,000 people left town. The flames were so intense that it created its own weather, like tornadoes within that forest fire. And you could see smoke from satellites. So it was a big one. In our province, we've had our share of weather extremes, and let me focus on flooding. In 2013, we had the Muskoka flooding. Nobody saw it coming. It was April, the beginning of April, the first half of April was fairly cold. There was 50 centimeters of snow sitting on the ground, so it hadn't melted at all. The ground was still frozen. The lakes and rivers were ice clogged. And then all of a sudden, a remarkable thing happened. Spring came, and it lasted 2 minutes. You went from slush to sweat. A tropical weather system came north with very warm temperatures and flooding monsoonal rains. And on top of the ice that was now melting and moving, and the snow was rapidly moving, you ended up with this flood that flooded 8 communities, declared states of emergency. You had $100 million in damages, sinkholes in the 400. I mean, it was clearly a big flood. And then came 3 months later, Toronto's torrent of water. A couple of weather systems off Georgian Bay, Lake Huron came through, dumped about 45 millimeters of rain in Camp Borden, and then headed to the big city. 17 millimeters in Richmond Hill fell, and then it just exploded over Toronto. In 2 hours, they got 126 millimeters of rain, more than fell during Hurricane Hazel in 1 day. And it was 3 millimeters in Oakville, 2 millimeters in Oshawa. It was the most targeted urban area of all of Canada by a heavy rainstorm. And of course, it ended up with the most expensive disaster in Ontario's history. In 2 hours, $1 billion of insurance loss and infrastructure loss from that particular storm. But it wasn't Toronto's only flood. The city had a major flood in 2005 that was also considered the province's most expensive flood or weather disaster in history. And it was called a 100-year storm. Hey, get used to it. I lived through 300 100-year events, you say. So it's just becoming more typical. And then, of course, the 2013, and then in 2015, you had more roads underwater, big floods that closed down the Don Valley. You had GO trains underwater, and that was a system. And then last year, my gosh, you had Lake Ontario reached its highest level on record since 1917. Lake Ontario never higher because of double the amount of rainfall in March, April, and May. And then you had Toronto Island was shut off for 2.5 months, again, because of monster situations. I'm not sure that Toronto has got the message. And then, of course, this, I think, goes down as the year of the big hurricane. As I mentioned, we had hurricanes, but they were nuisance, wet weekends, that was pretty well it. But you saw this year, it was the year of the big hurricane. More damage from weather in the United States than any other year in history. And they had in 4 weeks, Harvey and Irma and Jose and Maria and Ophelia. 6 major hurricanes in less than, sometimes 2 of them were going on at the same time. And you know, you can never you can never sort of fingerprint hurricane as being a result of climate change. Because and you can't do that with any weather event, because every weather event is unique and there are multiple causes of it. You know, you can maybe make a case for why it is maybe worse or more extreme because of climate change, but you clearly can't say that that storm came out of our tailpipes and smokestacks. But don't fool yourself. This is what climate change looks like in a world that chooses to ignore it or to see the ravages that it can present. I'm not saying Hurricane Harvey was a result of climate change, but disaster Harvey was caused not by climate change, but more by human decisions that ignore the threat of climate change. Here is a city that's 1,700 square kilometers of a concrete slab put down on a floodplain near an area where it's been known for centuries that have the biggest storms on Earth, and they choose to ignore the safety of their people. Hey, that is the result of that ignorance, and no building codes, no land use planning to speak of, and hey, they hopefully learned the lesson. So what can we conclude from what I've just sort of given you a litany of some of the miseries that have occurred? Well, one thing for sure, the costs have gone up. No question. You just ask your insurance agent. Don't take my word for it. Insurers will tell you now they pay out more for weather and water, and sometimes twice as much as they do for fires, which is the reason they got going in the first place. And we see that they think it's the stuff of biblical scriptures or Hollywood blockbusters. I mean, it's just the weather is mutated, and of course they have the numbers to show it. We also see governments. Governments are beginning to worry about climate. They used to ignore extremes of weather. It was sort of like snow removal budgets. You know, some years you won and some years you lost, you see? So that kind of thing. Now, what we're seeing are these extremes that are occurring so often, they're beginning to affect our ability to balance budgets or the performance of some of the economic indicators. Now, there's that National Disaster Financial Assistance Relief Fund the government has, the federal government has, where it pays out to communities who suffer natural disasters. They've paid out more for weather and water in the last 6 years than they paid out in the previous 39 years of that program. And even the business sector is beginning to take notice because shareholders and stockholders are saying to executives of business, not do you believe in climate change, but what are you doing about it, you say? And we also are breaking more records. I like to break records. I'm a climatologist. But, you know, I get excited by 1/10 of a degree or 1/2 millimeter. But the records that we're seeing are just like out of sight. It's like a home run hitter hitting a ball into the stands, but now it's out of the ballpark. You could not, in fact, I know this is not good science, but it's almost to suggest that there's something else at play here other than nature to have caused these extremes to be so much different than the previous extreme. You know, I mean, I can't tell you enough about how even daily records and rainfall records are just like a different world compared to what the previous record is. So, you know, what is behind this apparent increase in weird and wild and wacky weather? Well, it's important to realize that we're not creating new weather. It's not as if we're seeing tornadoes in Tottenham or sandstorms in Springwater. No, what we're seeing is the nature and the personality of the same old weather has changed its stripes. We're seeing events, for example, that are larger. They're more extreme. You know, when you increase, let's say at extreme you increase the wind speed by 10%. Well, by increasing it 10%, it yanks the tree maybe out of the tree ball and then throws it onto a car or a home. So you see, by increasing the weather by 10%, it causes 60% more in damage. So we're seeing that kind of thing playing out. We're seeing out of season, out of place. Events are lasting. It used to rain on Thursday and end on Thursday. Now it's raining on Thursday and still raining on Saturday. So we're seeing the duration of some of these extremes are much longer. And I always think, I used to say, the best thing about Canadian weather is that it hits and runs. It doesn't stand around and clobber you like it does in other parts of the world. It gets tired. It moves on. We're into the westerlies, you say, and it just takes it away. And now what we're seeing is these storms are taking their time. There's more time to spread its misery. We're seeing 50-year floods are becoming the 20-year flood. And this is what we are. And so it's not your grandparents' flood anymore. So it's still a flood, but it's different. It used to be that most of our flood worries were about, snow melt and ice jamming situations. We still have that, but now it's also the Texas gully washer impinged on top of that. The Muskoka flooding was like that. You had the big, heavy rainfall flood on top of the time when it was the Canadian flood trying to get rid of all that excess snow and ice. So we're seeing that as being different. The other thing that I think is very different too, is it's not used to be what's falling from the sky. Now you have to concern yourself of what kind of surface is it falling on? Because that is changing the formula. And you see, what we're finding is that our environment has been degraded such that, fields have been drained. We're draining wetlands. I mean, that is, I think, one of the big tragedies of Ontario. I mean, we've seen 72% of our original wetlands have disappeared, have been filled and developed. And in some cases, 95% of the wetlands have disappeared. Wetlands were nature's way of protecting us from the ravages of storms. And that's how, people said to me, was Katrina caused by humankind? I said, well, no. We've had major storms like that before. What was a factor, though, was the bayou in front of that, the city, had been developed, cemented over, and green space removed. So we've transferred, and we've cut down trees and not replace them. We've reclaimed land from the sea, straightening rivers. We build dams. I'm not against dams and reservoirs. I just want to state a fact that the surface of the earth has changed because of human activity. And when you go from a grassland to a wheat field to a parking lot, you change the reflectivity of that surface and you change the response of how that rain falling from the same sky is impacting that particular area. I'm not suggesting we go back to wooden sidewalks and dirt parking lots. I'm just suggesting that because the fabric has changed, therefore the response of weather has changed. And when you transfer green infrastructure from wildlands and wetlands into strip malls and parking lots, you change the water balance of that surface. And that is something that we have to consider. And urbanization is the fastest growing land use in the planet. And 50%, I say far greater in some major cities, maybe even 80% in Toronto, is really asphalt building material and paving. I mean, it is in fact, it's impervious to a raindrop. Doesn't matter how dry Toronto is, that raindrop becomes a flood drop when it falls on the Don Valley or on sidewalks or parking lots, do you say? So even without these climate change, I think the weather hits of the past would become major blows. There's another factor too. It's maybe we're hearing more about it. Can't rule that out. It's a smaller world. Doesn't matter whether it's in Bangladesh or Botswana or Bowmanville or Bolivia. If the weather is hitting there, people are going to hear about it. Social networks, the more you educate people about the weather, the more weather you get, you say. More reports of it, you say. And I can tell you, the one group of people who love extreme weather is the media. Hey, it beats Seinfeld and Simpsons in the ratings every night. if you can show Anderson Cooper standing in water to tell us not to stand in water, you say. I've called it storm porn. It's this notion that, we kind of are naughty. We like to see that stuff. I don't think we want people to suffer, but we're in awe of the power of nature, do you say? And so we have to consider the fact that there's no far off places anymore. But what has changed, though, ladies and gentlemen, is that we have changed, you and I. Society has changed. We're not what we used to be. Our attitudes, our views, our possessions have changed. There's twice as many people living now in Canada that lived there in the 1960s. We have more wealth. Wealth, I think, sometimes shields us from witnessing the day-to-day effects that people in other parts of the world see with extreme weather. I know that old smelly basement that I used to store my bike in as a kid is now a fitness room and an entertainment center. So when the weather hits in an extreme way, it's a big ticket item, you say. We also are living where we shouldn't be living, in floodplains and avalanche zones and by the sea. A third of the people in the world live within 100 kilometers of the ocean. These are graveyards in the waiting. It's a bigger target, higher risk when you are by the coastal areas. And of course, something else has changed. Our climate has changed. We've warmed up. No question about it. Whether you look in the boreholes or the tip of the stratosphere, the evidence is clearly. And you know what? You can't get scientists to agree on anything. It's like herding cats. But 98% of scientists believe, and every research institute and academy of science that I've seen, worth their salt, are saying the same thing. The weather is warming up faster and greater now than it has in a long time. Not that it's necessarily been warmer than it hasn't, but it is the speed of change has in fact warmed up. And these scientists are not cooking the books. They're not in cahoots. They're just reading the data and seeing the scientific and statistical significance of those changes. And these are changes that are precisely what was said was going to happen. I know. I was there 20 years ago when we tried to say, well, what would Canada look like in the year that we turned 150 years old? And you know what? We got it right, except for one thing. We didn't get the sea levels right. The sea levels have risen higher than were forecasted because nobody saw the ice caps in Greenland or in Antarctica melting to add water to the oceans. And so you can't, the other thing is that you can't explain what has happened strictly by physical features. If you took all of the physical features that have always changed and always will change our climate, volcanoes, solar output, Earth's tilt, and all of those factors which have always changed the climate, in the last 50 years, the Earth should have cooled off. But instead, it has warmed up. So there's only one thing you can conclude. It is showing that human activity, land use changes, and emissions have in fact contributed to that warming. And the evidence there, out today at a press release from the United Nations, that this was the 17 of the 18 warmest years in the last 135 have occurred since the year 2000. And so we had 2017. You might not have known it in Springwater, but it was the second warmest year on record, planet-wise, you see. And Canada has warmed up. We have, in 2017, we were in fact the 21st consecutive year with warmer than normal temperatures. And the one area that is really warming up the most is the Arctic. The Arctic is warming up 2 or 3 times faster than the global average of warming. The climate is unraveling in the north. I mean, it's just hard for me to believe that we could have an Arctic without ice. It would be like Niagara Falls without the falls, or Ontario without colored maple trees. I mean, it's just unthinkable. And yet the ice, when I began my career, that 85% of the ice in the north was that turquoise, that beautiful, that hard to break up ice, multi-year ice. Now it's only 12% of the ice. And it's hard to imagine that the ice in the Arctic is an Arctic that would be ice-free. It'd be like Great Lakes ice, rookie ice, there today and not in July. And that is frightening. And I think that will come to haunt us, is what's happening in the Arctic. Because the Arctic is one of the fundamental climate controls of this planet. It's the refrigerator of the planet. And when it changes weather. It's not an Inuit thing. It's a spring water thing. It is happening. We see this weather occurring elsewhere. It's a direct result of the fact that we're seeing a fundamental change to the north. Now, I'm a little bit behind. I'm going to have to speed up here. I'm going to, okay. So what impresses me, though, because I think the last species to know about climate change are people. We wait for the big black cloud to hang over us before we say, hey, it smells like rain, you say. But already we know the species, the fish, the insects, the birds, are being marginalized, being evicted because of climate change. We're seeing, for example, what could be more Canadian than the maple tree? We're now seeing that it used to be 80% of the sugar-off dates occurred after the first day of spring. Now 80% are occurring before the first day of spring. We're seeing magnolia trees growing in Sault Ste. Marie. Tulips on Parliament Hill growing 6 days earlier than they did 20 years ago. I predict in 35 years, Ottawa will be holding the Tulip Festival and Winterlude on the same weekend. We're seeing the Virginia opossum, a creature never seen in Ontario before 1980. Now it's at Meaford and heading northward. We're seeing forest fires, the Canadian boreal forest, twice the number of fires in the last 35 years. Longer fires, earlier fires. But hey, it's not just climate change. It's also the way we fight fires. There are people who set fires to have jobs to fight fires, you say. It's hard to figure it out, you say, but hey, there's still a climate issue there. Biologists are reporting that more examples of ecological mismatches. Flowers are opening up, but the pollinating insects haven't arrived yet. Or birds migrating from the south to the north are arriving after their bug meals have long gone, you say. So we're seeing those kind of conflicts that exist in nature that is not good. And of course, we're also seeing the deer tick. I mean, the one good thing about our winters, this winter is probably classic, traditional that way, that winters used to beat up all the vermins and the varmints and the diseases and the viruses. They couldn't survive our winters, you say. We were actually fortunate that way. But now, with some winters, not this one, but the last two, for example, deer ticks are surviving. And we're seeing physicians are reporting a greater incidence of Lyme disease. Avril Lavigne suffered a very bad case of Lyme disease being bitten by a deer tick in her home in York Region, you say. So it's something that is occurring here. And I suggest to you, if you still don't, I don't have time to go over more evidence, but I suggest that you look in your backyard and you will see ample proof that we're living through warmer times, you say. Now, why should we worry about this? You know, here is a cloud. Margaret likes to read clouds and teach her grandson about clouds. Well, here is a cloud that you see often hanging over Parliament Hill, you say. But, you know, we live in the second coldest country in the world, the snowiest country in the world. What's wrong with warming it up a little bit? I go to Winnipeg and I say to the people, the good people there, I say, you know, I've got some bad news. Your winters are going to be 5 degrees warmer. They say, could you make it 10 degrees? You know, there's good reason to believe that it's not, that what will beat us up are greater extremes and greater variability of weather, not slushier winters and earlier springs. That's not the issue. It's greater extremes. Because what does climate do? What it does is it warms up the air and you get more heavier doses of rain. It's a scientific fact that we've known for 200 years. Not complicated. When you warm up the air by 1 degree, it can hold 7 to 12% more moisture. So when it rains, there's a heavier dose of rain that's possible under that warmer kind of scenario, you say. And so it's not complicated. And the hydrologic cycle gets all juiced up. It doesn't go in nice, slow increments, but sometimes all of that energy is released all at once. But you see, for me, as I say, it's important to realize that climate change doesn't create weather, it just ramps it up. It's like climate is steroids for storms, you say. It gives it more kind of to be nasty and intense and longer lasting, or something about its character that makes it a bit evil. Now, extremes occur here and maybe not there. People are not necessarily hit by extremes. I'm not sure about spring water, whether I could go back and pick out recent extremes that have occurred more often than the past. But in some areas you can. But the one thing that has beat everybody up, that is very difficult to deal with, is this increase of what we call the variability, the wild swings in weather. It's almost it used to be that summers were hot and winters were cold. And now it's almost as if it's like a joker in the weather deck. It's like a Jekyll and Hyde kind of personality. It's like weather whiplash. And we see that variation where you can't plan based on that kind of weather condition. Farmers have said to me, we had the wettest growing season followed by the driest. I mean, look at the Holland Marsh. Last year, 2016, they had their driest growing season on record. This year, the wettest. Real challenges. But what do you do when you average that to? You get normal. It was anything but normal, you say. And so this is what we are seeing. It used to be, I used to say, we had the Goldilocks of weather. Not too hot, not too cold, just kind of right. And what we're seeing that is more and more. I mean, let me give you a couple local examples. Here in Springwater, I mean, the last 2 summers are probably kind of a good example of the incredible variability that we've seen. 2 summers ago, hey, that was the best beer drinking weather I've ever seen. You had 31 days where the temperature was above 30. Last year, 4. How do you deal with that? Or rainfall. We had the previous year, compared to this year, we had double the rainfall this year compared to that. And on the weekends, it was like not even close in terms of 2016. A lot of people said to me they liked the weather in 2016. But a lot of people whispered to me that they liked the weather in 2017. It wasn't something you'd want to make known when you've got all these wet weekends, you say. But clearly, there was a difference there, you say. And we've seen it also in our winters. I mean, with this winter aside, but the last 2 were very warm. The 2 before that were very cold, quite different. And like you wonder, well, where's average? Where's normal? Normal doesn't exist anymore. It's like one swing of the pendulum to the other. And we base all of our strategies, our plans, and policies based on normal. And when it happens like this, you think, oh, well, that was the 100-year event. We won't see that in my lifetime again. Not, you see it the next year, or the total reverse, the other. So that's what we mean by, oh, gee, I'm so far behind. Let me give you a forecast. Not for the rest of the winter. That's too difficult. I'll tell you what the weather is going to be like in 50 years from now. And I don't think a lot of people are out there that will be able to take me up on this, you say. So I think it's a good forecast, you say. Well, really simply, warmer, wetter, and wilder. That's what I say. And in spring water, I've suggested that in, say, the year 2055, the temperatures on average, winter, summer, will be about 3 degrees warmer than they are now. Doesn't seem like a lot. But I can challenge you, 1 degree is like a sea change in climate circles. And so it's hard let me relate it this way. Let's break down that 3 degrees warming in winter and summer and say what it would feel like. Maybe this will register. What we call tropical nights, a night where the temperature stays above 20. And I can tell you, that kills people in heat waves. It's not the daytime temperature, it's the nighttime temperature. that killed all those people in Europe and Chicago when they tried to survive that particular heat wave. So here in spring water, you get on average about 6 nights a year where the temperature stays above 20. That's a lot of tossing and turning. You don't feel very productive the next day if you've slept through a night with 20 degrees or above. Well, in 2055, we'll see 20 of those nights. And in 20 years after that, 26 of those. So that's what the models are suggesting, to go from 6 to 20 to 26. The number of hot days. You get on average about 10 hot days a year above 30. In 2050, we see 30, and in the 2080, we see 50. So again, that's a fundamental change to your climate and how to deal with it. In terms of precipitation, well, it'll be hotter days, of course, but we also see, with regards to precipitation, expect more acute and chronic water problems, too much water sometimes, and too little water most of the time. Because even though the precipitation will go up by, we think, about 10 or 15%, it won't match the increase of temperature. So there'll be issues with regards to water in terms of when it floods, there will be heavier doses of rain, may not rain as often. We will certainly see effects on aquifers and drier wetlands and private wells and what you might imagine would be, in fact, happen if you have a less supply. What about wilder weather? Can't say for sure how much or where. We just know the conditions that produce that wild weather will be more prevalent in the years to come. And we certainly see more lightning events. Probably when every degree you warm up, you get about 12% more lightning events. So we could see maybe a 30% increase in lightning hits in the years to come. Hail, fewer hailstorms, but larger hailstones. You see, that's an issue. And people think, oh, well, we'll be Miami of the North. It might surprise you that you might see more freezing rain. Because you see, when your average temperature in the winter is -7, and you go to -2 or -3, you're closer to that sweet zone where you, in fact, could get more ice pellets, freezing rain. So our models suggest maybe a 35 to 50% increase in the amount of freezing rain. So winners, there are winners and losers. One of the big winners is agriculture. We see a longer growing season by 1 to 1.5 months, 30% more in growing degree days, hardy plant zones from 5B to 6B. That will mean something to backyard gardeners. They could be pleased with that. New exciting cultivars that will be on the scene. I mean, farmers don't always believe what I say about climate change, but yet they admit they're growing things now they could only dreamed about 30 years ago, you see. So climate change has provided some winners in that, but then of course it also means bugs and diseases and pests are going to be issues, that more spraying, more dealing with that under a warmer kind of condition. For fishing, we know that already some of our desirable cold water species are having a hard time. When you warm up the water of streams and lakes and rivers by 20 to 24 degrees, then trout can't exist in that. And we've already seen in Ontario, we've lost about 120 bodies of water because of this warmer water, where the models suggest by 2050, we'll have lost 1,600 such bodies of water too. And more, then there would be more sort of warm water species. So let me go to what we should do about it. Well, I think everybody needs to be concerned about climate change. I think it's not something that most Canadians seem to see. They're concerned, but it's a go slow approach. It's futuristic. It's something that is distant. Isn't that about skinny polar bears or coral reef bleaching? Or isn't it about ozone holes? It's not something that we're familiar with, you say, and even how to deal with it. You know, we can deal with recession and we can deal with unemployment and terrorism, but climate change is not like the tools in our toolbox to be able to handle that in a kind of an understanding way. And so that's sometimes the barriers to responding to it, especially in a local level. And it's like a tremor, not an earthquake. There's no kind of Pearl Harbor moment. But I think it's important to realize that every community is going to be affected by this. And I think that even in the township of Springwater, I can't imagine a department in your township that would not be impacted to some degree by climate change. Maybe some more serious than others, some maybe in a positive way, others maybe in a negative way, but clearly no one is going to be left out in the cold. And what we need to do is we need to cut back, yes, on our fossil fuel emissions. We have to do that for our health, for the economy, to save the planet a little bit, to stop the warm up, which I think is important. But all the CO2 that you emitted today, in your life today, is going to be there in 100 years. So it's not as if we can remove it, you say. And so what we need to do is to wean our way off of the insatiable appetite that we have for fossil fuels. It'll still be the fuel of the future, but we have to begin to be serious about it, not just trade it and bury it, but to begin to remove it. And there are some communities in Ontario that have tried to do something, have embraced it, have seen it as a way of saving people money, saving their stuff. I remember seeing just the other day, I read about Summerside PEI. In October, they spent 70% of their energy use in that city was on solar power. And I thought that was a great progress that they've made. Some months you can't be all that much, but they did, so that's significant. So certainly energy efficient, planting trees to minimize energy loss on the properties, encouraging, for example, local food production and distribution through community gardens and farmer markets. I think it's a very positive thing. It's reduce car idling, for example, and maybe more roundabouts and naturalization of urban parks. There are a lot of things that communities have done to try to cut back on the use of fossil fuels. And then finally, the one that I like to preach about is the fact that what we need to do is also to adapt. We need to do things differently to prepare for it. Some people think that, nature's gonna get you. You might as well just grin and bear it. But I don't think that's inevitable. I think that it doesn't necessarily mean you get that storm coming your way, you can't stop it. But by preparing for it, you can in fact cushion the blow. It doesn't have to be a disaster. It can be a storm, but it doesn't have to be a disaster if you are in fact preparing for it and building up your resiliency to withstand that, and not just sucking off of 50-year-old infrastructure. When you see an opportunity to build or to enhance one's infrastructure, consider the climate change aspects. In fact, I think that any decision that a council makes that has implications for 20 years from now, they should ask about the climate change. Not be a killer of the project, but just to ask developers about, hey, what impact will that development have on our local climate, and what impact will climate change have on that development? Just getting information about that is important. And I think individuals have to understand the responsibility that they have with regards to this, not just suggest that, hey, I pay taxes, so let the community bail me out, or I pay insurance, let them bail me out. I think there's a responsibility of individuals for their own homestead to build a safer and more resilient kind of property. And the thing is, when you look at it, it's not a big ticket item. It's things like backwater valves, maybe, if one has that kind of a sewer system, or it's proper grading, or it's a lot of things that are not big, expensive things to be able to build up resiliency and improve the situation. And I think even for communities, for example, it is in fact, I think some communities of the opinion that it's a big ticket item. It's a matter of building domes or seawalls to protect us from the elements. It's not that. It is sometimes you have the tools already in your toolbox in terms of things like tax incentives or land use planning or zoning or urban update or flood mapping or just buying up properties or putting in, vulnerable pieces of facilities in less vulnerable areas. So these are the things that we need to do. We need to, for example, even just maintain. I think sometimes we saw it with Toronto. Those neighborhoods that during the ice storm they had in that 2013, those neighborhoods where the trees had been pruned the summer before did not suffer power outages. So instead of like maintenance and budgets are the first to go, think about the implications that might have on your community. So hey, I've gone over time. I want to just maybe conclude with one or two final points. I think for me, climate change is affecting all regions and all seasons and in all sectors. I think it is something that is not necessarily foreign to us. I think that we can't necessarily wait for all the answers to come in to begin to do something about it. I've taken by this quote from the Nottawasaga Valley Conservation Authority in their climate strategy and action plan. They say, uncertainty will not be used as an excuse for inaction. And I think just because we don't know everything about climate change doesn't mean we should ignore what we do know about it. I think this is not a fight against climate change. It is really, in fact, to show how we can better live with the climate we've got and the climate we're going to get. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, David. We're certainly open to a few questions as long as we're wrapped up here in about 10 minutes so we can get ready for our council meeting. I checked with our Director of Finance. I figure with such a big audience, maybe we could hand out $5 tax rebates to each, but apparently that's not allowed. So it'd be nice to have everyone remain for our council meeting. It's a light agenda. You can see how we operate. But I open the floor. I think Renee here has a microphone. If you have some questions you'd like to direct to Mr. Phillips, please do.
Yes, this is regarding the Arctic ice. Is it mainly just the increased temperature that the ice is decreased so much? Or is it there's the big black hole up there and it's getting more?
Yeah. I think it's a good question. You know, what we've seen in the Arctic is that clearly we have seen temperatures have warmed dramatically. If you look at it more than any other part, as they say, 2 or 3 times what we've seen on the global average. And it's sort of one begets the other. We've also seen snowfall disappearing. And we have seen, and so therefore, when you have that white surface, then the solar radiation coming in, about 90% of it is reflected off those surfaces. And so it sort of doesn't go to work for you. Doesn't melt anything, doesn't melt the permafrost or anything. But if in fact you end up with less snow cover, less ice, darker surfaces, then more of that solar radiation is absorbed and therefore warms up that surface. So it's like a snowball. You know, once it gets going, it's hard to stop. We're also seeing, you know, and this is, if I had time, I would have described it in more detail. We're seeing a fundamental change to our jet stream. Our jet stream is this river of air that crosses the continent, where cold air to the north, warm air to the south. Now, often in my lifetime as a climatologist, it looked like a bungee cord stretching across from west to east. And the cold air stayed up there and the warm air stayed down here. But what we're seeing more and more is that it looks like a roller coaster. It is, in fact, because you're changing the temperature. And what is the jet stream? Well, it's driven, it's created its strength, and the jet stream, that's essentially the jet stream, is very strong winds at an upper level. That's where pilots will fly from Vancouver to Toronto catching the jet stream, or they'll avoid it coming back, you see. And so what the jet stream is doing is that it is, because that temperature difference between north and south is less, it is in fact weakening the jet stream. So it looks like this kind of so it's taking its sweet time for weather to move across the country, and that's having impacts. But the point is that you see sometimes when it's like this, if you picture the north of Canada and the jet stream is looking like this, then where it's ridging up north, we're seeing a flow of warmer air right up to the north. That's why you saw that sometime before Christmas, the North Pole was like 10 degrees warmer than in spring water. And Alaska was warmer in Tuktoyaktuk in Canada than it was in Tallahassee, Florida. Because what you had is that warm air surging northward, and it then caused a return flow coming back the other way. And so that's why it's so difficult in my business, and because the people who don't believe in climate change, and hey, there are people that don't, and I appreciate that. But people think, oh yeah, and you know what they're saying now? All this cold weather is caused because of global warming. When in fact, there's an element of truth to it. Because if you've got this kind of jet stream, you're seeing these surges of warm air coming to the north, and then a reverse cold air. In fact, this warm air that came up, it took the polar vortex, that air that just spins around at the top, stays up there. Even in the summertime, it's up there, and it's just spinning around and around. Well, what it did is it kind of went right through it and broke it up. It weakened it. People think the polar vortex is weak. I said, yes, and that's why it's left home. It's come down to us, you say. So that's why, so it's not just temperature, it's air currents, it's general circulation, it's snow disappearing. That's why you can't build ice roads in the north anymore. There are more search and rescues of Inuit people. They're going different. And you're seeing, they had to hold a conference about 10 years ago to come up with new words in the Inuktitut language. Robin, magpie, barn owl. They'd never seen these creatures before. And they were now living and staying up there, you say. So it is, if we can understand the north, I think it helps us understand the circulation in the south. Because, hey, it's all related, you say. But yes, it's temperature, it's disappearance of white cover, and it's general circulation changes.
Yes, hi. Very good presentation, by the way. And my question relates, how do we, or people in general, convince, number one, government, and number two, businesses, corporations, to the here and now that climate change has happened, and there's certainly the evidence put forth, and even to the general public. When, you know, we start using our bicycles more and we start walking more to those short, for example, those short distances, and I'll turn it over to yourself to answer.
Well, that's a very good question. I mean, I think it's a matter of, you know, how can we demonstrate that this is an issue, and that in some of the audiences you're speaking of, politicians, maybe it's the ballot box, or maybe you ask questions in meetings about what are you doing about climate change, or that development, have you considered it? I know it sounds like, you know, crying wolf and one voice in the wilderness, but it is a matter of approaching it that way. And in terms of businesses, I think it's consumers have a real advantage that they can, in fact, demand businesses do various things in terms of packaging, for example. I think it's one of education. I sometimes have just depressed and disappointed by what the action we've taken until I see young people, and I see young people and what they're learning and they're doing and what comes natural to them. It's hard to get me to change my ways, but in fact, I think younger people, they give me hope for the future. So I think it's just a matter of pyramid selling in a way. It's just like trying to build up this committed people and showing by example. But hey, there's not one item. I mean, even if, you know, for the United States, I thought Harvey would have done it. I thought Maria would have done it. And it didn't, you know. It's like Sandy didn't do it. It's almost as if, like, what will do it is if Miami disappears or New York goes under. I mean, I just think that it's not extreme events. They, get hit, people make some changes, and then they go back to the same way. It's like replacement in kind. When people have a chance to change the infrastructure, they just restore it. And I have a problem with insurance people with that. I'll say, just don't take that opportunity to build something better so that you are paying attention and building better with the climate in mind, not just paying back because, hey, that's what they had before. I mean, that replacement in kind is just nonsensical to me. It doesn't make sense when we know fundamentally the climate has changed. And so I think there's an opportunity when we build infrastructure, replace infrastructure, that we consider the fact that our climate has fundamentally changed.
One more question, I think, back there. Okay.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I think you managed to worry us even more. The business of trading carbon credits and introducing more and more green taxes, what's your position on that? Do you think it's going to help solve this problem? Thank you.
It's a good question, and I'm just not an expert on that. I stay with the science and not so much the policy. It's not that I'm avoiding it. It's just that you probably have a better opinion, a more learned opinion than I have of it. I'm a government employee, and so therefore I have to be careful about what I say about public policy, particularly the last government.
Actually, we have one more question.
Okay.
Over here, and then, well, the reason we're cutting the questions off, but David, maybe you can hang around for a little bit if anybody wants to talk to you, because we have a little demonstration by a group that they want to make to council. So anyway, you can definitely stay and have a chat and whatever, but maybe the question for the audience here.
You talked about the precipitation being stronger than Hurricane Hazel, some of the events. And you talked about the 100-year record, that a lot of people use for planning. So is it fair that you still use the 100-year plan for Hurricane Hazel, yet we know events have been stronger than that precipitation? Because you talk about us being able to plan for the future, and 30 years, you're talking about a big change. So I just wanted to see, how do we change those stats if Hurricane Hazel is the stat that's being used?
Well, it's very, very good. No one's ever asked me that. I think it's a very valid kind of question, because Hurricane Hazel has been always the gold standard for urban design. If you could handle Hurricane Hazel, you could handle anyone. You say anything. It was like considered to be a 200 or 300-year event, you say. Some people even considered the fact that you over-design and you were spending more money if you designed by Hurricane Hazel. What we know now is that Hurricane Hazel was like a river flood, where these other ones tend to be more urban floods. So it's a little bit different than that. But I can tell you that the planners in major cities like Toronto, all the consultants, they get as much information as they can on rainfall, intense rainfall rates, so that they're constantly trying to update their figures and their diagrams and their stats. So when they present to council or to levels of government, they can give them what the latest 100-year return period would be. And that's why we can say that the 100-year return period is the 100-year storm is now like the 50-year storm. So we've more data to work into that. But there's no question that what we've seen, events like that all over Canada, are clearly different than the 100-year event that we knew about back in 1954. So it's a matter of professionals working with the best data available to them to modify their estimates and projections and their models for the future.
Okay, thank you. Again, thank you, David. That was a great presentation. And council is here. We have a demonstration at the back, and if you're interested in that in the audience also, we have a special kind of a community fund that we sponsor events, and there's a robotics a team that went and competed, and they're going to do a little demonstration for us in that back area in about 2 minutes. And or asked Mr. Phillips any further questions, but I really appreciate having this turnout, and certainly invite you to hang around and enjoy our council meeting. As I said, it's not a heavy agenda tonight, but there's some important items, there always is, that you may want to be aware of. But anyway, thank you for coming to this special presentation.